"I'm sorry, Miss Graham," the buyer said calmly over the phone. "I was told all that's missing is your signature." My signature? Why was a stranger calling me about selling my lake house? Why did the contract already carry my husband's initials? And why did he sound genuinely confused when I told him my home had never been for sale? Seconds later, an email landed in my inbox. Attached was a purchase agreement listing my lake house, a closing date only 4 days away, and an empty signature line waiting for my name. That was the moment I realized someone hadn't just lied to me. They had built an entire plan around the assumption that I would quietly go along with it. Before I tell you how I uncovered everything, I'd love to know where you're watching from and what time it is in your part of the world. If stories about family trust and standing up for yourself resonate with you, I'd really appreciate you subscribing so you don't miss the rest of this journey. By the time I reached the lake, the sun was already sinking behind the pine trees. The familiar drive should have felt comforting. Instead, every mile made my stomach tighten. I had driven that road hundreds of times over the years. My Aunt Eleanor had bought the property decades earlier, back when the shoreline was mostly fishing cabins and gravel roads. After she passed away, she left the lake house to me, not because I was the oldest niece, but because I was the only one who had spent every summer helping her repair dock stain decks and winterize the place. She used to joke that I knew the house better than any contractor ever would. That house wasn't simply real estate. It was the last place where I still felt close to her. As I turned into the driveway, I immediately knew something was wrong. There were 4 vehicles parked outside: Nathan's SUV, Patricia's luxury sedan, Richard's pickup, and a white crossover with the logo of a local real estate company on the driver's door. I slowed to a stop. For several seconds, I simply sat there with the engine running. Maybe there was an explanation. Maybe the realtor had the wrong property. Maybe Michael had misunderstood everything. Then I noticed the small black lockbox hanging from the front door handle. My hands tightened around the steering wheel. Only licensed agents use those. Nobody had asked my permission. Nobody had even called. I got out of the car and walked toward the porch. Before I reached the door, laughter drifted through the open windows. Patricia's voice. "Buyers love open spaces. We told them most of the furniture could stay." Nathan laughed softly. "They've already seen the photos. This weekend is really just confirming everything." Richard added, "Once the paperwork is finished, we won't have to think about this place again." My heart started pounding. I pushed the front door open. The conversation stopped instantly. 4 heads turned toward me. Nathan's smile disappeared. "Lyla." Patricia recovered first. "Oh," she said brightly. "You're here earlier than we expected." Earlier than they expected? I looked around the living room. Almost everything had changed. The quilt Aunt Eleanor had sewn herself was folded neatly into a storage box. Several framed family photographs had vanished from the mantel. The old rocking chair where she used to drink coffee every morning had been moved into a corner, replaced by 2 modern accent chairs. Fresh flowers sat on the dining table. Designer throw pillows I had never bought were arranged perfectly across the couch. The room no longer looked lived in. It looked staged, like a model home. "What is this?" I asked quietly. Nathan walked toward me with both palms raised. "Let's not make this bigger than it needs to be." That sentence alone told me everything. If there had been a reasonable explanation, he would have started with it. Instead, he wanted me to calm down before I even knew the truth. I looked directly at Patricia. "Why is there a realtor's lockbox on my front door?" She smiled with practiced patience. "We've just been preparing." "For what?" "The sale." She said it so casually it almost sounded normal, as if she had just mentioned grocery shopping. I stared at her. "The sale of what?" She frowned slightly. The lake house. My lake house. Richard sighed. Lyla, nobody's trying to upset you. Then answer the question. Nathan stepped between us. We were going to explain everything. When he hesitated. Soon. I laughed once. Not because anything was funny, because soon apparently meant 4 days before closing. I pulled out my phone and opened Michael's email. I just spoke with the buyer. The room became completely silent. Nathan looked down. Patricia folded her arms. Richard stared toward the windows. So, I continued, would one of you like to explain why a complete stranger believes he's buying my property? Patricia answered before anyone else. You make it sound so dramatic. I haven't even started. She took a slow breath. Lyla, this house has been sitting here for years. I come here almost every month. You hardly use it. I use it exactly as much as I choose. Richard crossed his arms. It's valuable property. I know. The market is excellent. I know. It doesn't make financial sense to leave money sitting here. I looked at him. So you decided to sell it? He actually looked surprised by the question. We decided it was the practical solution. Nathan finally spoke. I agreed. I didn't ask whether you agreed. His face tightened. I mean, we all discussed it. You discussed selling something you don't own. Nobody answered. Instead, Patricia walked toward the kitchen. Lyla, sometimes emotions make people focus on ownership instead of what's best for everyone. That sentence landed harder than she probably intended. Ownership. As though legal ownership were just a technical detail. As though the deed carrying only my name meant less than the Graham family's opinion. I followed her. Who hired the realtor? Nathan raised his hand. I contacted her. You signed paperwork. I signed preliminary documents. You represented yourself as the seller. I represented us. There is no us on that deed. He rubbed the back of his neck. I thought we'd finalize everything together. When, again, silence. I walked into the dining room. Stacks of glossy brochures sat neatly on the table. The front page displayed a beautiful aerial photograph. Lakefront retreat with private dock. The photography was stunning. The sunlight, the shoreline, the fire pit. Even Aunt Eleanor's flower garden. Someone had spent real money marketing my home. I opened one brochure. There was a complete property description, square footage, renovation history, recent improvements, expected closing timeline, the asking price. Every detail was accurate, which meant somebody had spent weeks preparing this, not days. Weeks. I looked around more carefully. The bedrooms had matching white bedding, fresh towels, neutral decorations. Half the personal photographs were gone. The closets looked almost empty. The pantry had been reorganized. Even the refrigerator held bottled water arranged in perfect rows. This wasn't preparation. This was staging. Professional staging. Then another detail caught my attention. Near the fireplace sat a clipboard. Printed showing schedules, appointment times, names. At least 7 private property tours had already taken place. 7. Strangers had walked through my house, opened my cabinets, looked through my windows, walked onto my dock, all without a single phone call to me. I slowly lifted the clipboard. When exactly were you planning to mention these? Nathan swallowed. We didn't think it would matter until we had a serious buyer. You've had 7. They weren't offers, but they were inside my home. Patricia stepped closer. Lyla, no one damaged anything. I looked directly at her. That's your defense. We protected the property. You violated my trust. They're different things. No, I said quietly. They aren't. Nathan finally reached for my hand. I know this looks terrible. I stepped backward. No, it doesn't look terrible. It is terrible. For the first time that evening, nobody had a response. The silence stretched across the room. Outside waves tapped gently against the dock, exactly the way they had every summer since Aunt Eleanor first brought me here as a little girl. The lake hadn't changed. The house hadn't betrayed me. The people standing inside it had. As I turned toward the hallway, something else caught my eye. The wall beside the staircase looked strangely empty. For years, 3 framed photographs had hung there, one of Aunt Eleanor teaching me to fish, one of us rebuilding the dock after a storm, and one taken the day she handed me the keys with a smile that said she trusted me to protect this place. Now all 3 were gone. I stared at the empty nail holes in the wall. Nathan. He looked up. Where are Aunt Eleanor's photographs? No one answered. I stood there staring at the empty wall longer than anyone else in the room seemed comfortable with. 3 tiny nail holes, 3 faint rectangles where the paint hadn't faded. That was all that remained. Nathan followed my gaze. They're packed away. Where? In one of the storage bins. Which one? I'm not sure. He wasn't lying because he couldn't remember. He was lying because he hadn't expected me to notice. Patricia stepped in before I could press further. We removed personal items because buyers respond better when they can imagine themselves living here. I turned toward her. So my aunt's photographs were considered clutter. They were sentimental. They were part of the home. They weren't part of the sale. That sentence settled over the room like cold fog, not part of the sale. As though Aunt Eleanor's life could simply be edited out to increase the asking price. I didn't argue, not because I agreed, because I had reached the point where emotions were no longer useful. Engineers are trained to separate assumptions from evidence. Feelings tell you something is wrong. Evidence tells you exactly where it broke. I looked around the living room one last time, then I picked up the brochure again. Who is your realtor? Nathan hesitated. Jennifer Brooks. Office. He named a local brokerage about 15 minutes away. I nodded once. I'm leaving. Lyla, I'm not discussing this until I know exactly what you've done. Patricia crossed her arms. Running to lawyers isn't going to solve family problems. I'm not running anywhere. I slipped the brochure into my bag. I'm collecting facts. No one followed me outside. As I drove away, my phone buzzed. Nathan. I let it ring. Then another call. Ignored. A text appeared moments later. Can we please talk before you start assuming the worst? I almost laughed. Assuming someone had installed a realtor's lockbox on my front door. Someone had scheduled private showings. Someone had negotiated with buyers. Those weren't assumptions. Those were observable facts. By the time I reached my apartment in Minneapolis, it was nearly 10. I spread everything I had collected across my dining table. Michael's email, the purchase agreement, the glossy brochure, a photograph I had quietly taken of the showing schedule. I began writing down every question that still needed an answer. Who signed what? Who authorized the listing? How far had the sale progressed? Could anyone legally transfer ownership without me? What exactly did the buyer know? One answer mattered more than all the others. Who actually owned the property today? I already believed I knew, but belief wasn't enough. I wanted proof. The next morning I drove to the county recorder's office. Government buildings are rarely dramatic. Fluorescent lights, gray carpet, plastic chairs, people waiting quietly with folders in their laps. Exactly the kind of place where facts mattered more than opinions. A clerk named Melissa greeted me with a warm smile. How can I help you today? I need to verify ownership records for a property. She asked for the address. Within minutes, she pulled the electronic file onto her monitor. She turned the screen slightly so I could see. Owner Lyla Marie Graham. No co-owner. No trust. No transfer. No lien affecting ownership. No pending deed. I felt myself exhale for what seemed like the first time in 24 hours. So nothing has changed. Melissa shook her head. Not according to county records. Has anyone filed transfer paperwork recently? She checked again. No. What about deeds waiting to be recorded? No pending submissions. I thanked her. As I stood to leave, she added something that stayed with me. A lot of people assume a purchase agreement transfers ownership. It doesn't. The deed is what matters. Simple, clear, legal. For the first time since Michael's phone call, I knew one thing with certainty. My house was still mine. That didn't erase the betrayal, but it gave me solid ground to stand on. My next stop was Jennifer Brooks' real estate office. The receptionist looked up. Do you have an appointment? No. But I think Jennifer will want to speak with me. A few minutes later, Jennifer walked into the lobby. She looked to be in her early 50s, professionally dressed, carrying a tablet. Ms. Graham, you know who I am. Her expression changed immediately. Yes. I believe we should talk. She invited me into a conference room. As soon as the door closed, she spoke first. I had a feeling this conversation might eventually happen. That surprised me. You did. She nodded slowly. I've been uncomfortable with parts of this transaction. Then why continue? She folded her hands together. Because your husband represented himself as handling the sale with your full knowledge. My husband isn't on the deed. I know that now. The wording caught my attention. Now, Jennifer opened a file. When Mr. Graham first contacted me, he explained the property had always been managed jointly. She slid a document across the table. The listing agreement. Nathan's signature appeared at the bottom. Only Nathan's, no second signature, no mention of mine. He said you were traveling frequently for work, Jennifer continued. He said getting your signature immediately would delay marketing. So you listed my house anyway. We listed it as owner approval pending. That phrase was printed near the bottom in small type. I kept reading. Several pages later, I found internal notes. Seller requests quick closing. Cash offers preferred. Minimal contingencies. Owner unavailable during travel. Family requests discretion. I looked up. Family requests discretion. Jennifer nodded. Your mother-in-law emphasized that repeatedly. What exactly did she say? Jennifer hesitated. I waited. Finally, she answered. She told us you become overwhelmed during financial decisions. I almost smiled. Not because it was funny, because Patricia had carefully chosen language that sounded protective rather than insulting. Not irrational, not unstable, just too emotional. It was the kind of description that quietly encouraged professionals to communicate through someone else. Did you ever ask to speak with me? Jennifer looked genuinely embarrassed. Twice. What happened? Mr. Graham said your engineering projects often took you into restricted areas where you couldn't answer calls. Another lie. I work in bridge rehabilitation. My phone works just fine. Jennifer sighed. I realize that now. She opened another folder. I think you should have copies of these. Inside were emails, dozens of them. Nathan discussing pricing, Patricia suggesting staging changes, scheduling photographers, planning open houses, coordinating inspections. None of them copied me, not one. Then I reached an email from Patricia. The subject line read, "Keep everything moving." The body was short. Lyla trusts Nathan with these matters. She's very attached to the property emotionally, so it's easier if we present everything once we've reached the finish line. I read it twice. There it was. Not confusion, not poor communication, a deliberate strategy. Move first. Tell Lyla later. I looked at Jennifer. When did you first realize something wasn't right? She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she opened her calendar. 3 days ago. What changed? The title company asked why the legal owner hadn't participated in a single meeting. I felt another piece fall into place. So they questioned it. They did. And they requested confirmation before closing. Before I could ask another question, my phone vibrated. A notification from the title company. Subject closing package ready for final review. I opened the email. The appointment was scheduled for Monday morning, 3 days away. I looked at Jennifer. Who will be there? The buyer. The escrow officer. The title officer. She paused. And they were expecting your signature. I slipped the phone back into my purse. For the first time since this nightmare had begun, I wasn't reacting anymore. I was planning. If everyone expected me to appear on Monday, then Monday would be the first time every piece of this story would be sitting in the same room. I barely slept Sunday night. Not because I was afraid, because my mind wouldn't stop organizing information. At some point around 2 a.m, I gave up, pretending I was going to rest. I spread every document across my kitchen table one more time. The purchase agreement Michael had emailed me, the realtor's listing agreement, Jennifer's internal notes, printed copies of Patricia's emails, the county ownership record. I arranged them in chronological order. Engineers don't solve problems by guessing. We look for patterns. The pattern here was becoming impossible to ignore. Every important decision had been made while I was traveling for work. Every major conversation had happened without me. Every document described me as unavailable, emotional, or already in agreement. Not one piece of paperwork contained an outright forged signature. That was what bothered me most. Nathan hadn't tried to steal my house by pretending to be me. He had tried to maneuver everyone into believing my signature would eventually appear because after enough pressure I would simply give in. It wasn't identity theft. It was calculated emotional coercion. That distinction mattered legally, and it mattered even more to me personally, because it meant Nathan had known exactly where my line was. He simply believed he could move it. Monday morning arrived gray and cool. The title company occupied the second floor of a brick office building overlooking downtown. The lobby was quiet. A receptionist greeted me with a practiced smile. "Good morning. How may I help you?" "My name is Lyla Graham." The smile faded almost imperceptibly. "Oh." She typed something into her computer. "One moment, please." A few seconds later, a woman in her 50s stepped into the lobby. "I'm Susan Ellis." She extended her hand. "I'm the senior title officer." Her handshake was firm, professional, but there was also something cautious in her expression. "Thank you for coming in, Miss Graham. I had no intention of missing this meeting." She nodded. "I suspected you might feel that way." She led me into a conference room. No one else had arrived yet. The closing folders were already sitting neatly at each chair. One folder immediately caught my attention. Across the cover in bold black letters, Graham Property Purchase. Susan noticed where I was looking. "I imagine you have quite a few questions." "I do." She sat across from me. "I'd like to start with ownership." She opened her computer. "Our title search confirms that you are the sole legal owner." "I know." She looked relieved. "I'm glad." I waited. She continued carefully. "Which is why we requested your personal appearance before authorizing anything further." I leaned forward. "When did you first realize something wasn't right?" Susan didn't hesitate. When we received the preliminary closing package, what stood out? There was only one owner. But every communication had come from your husband. She turned the monitor slightly toward me. The title timeline appeared on the screen. Listing accepted, offer received, earnest money deposited, inspection completed, financing waived, closing scheduled, owner verification pending. The final line was highlighted in yellow. Pending. Nothing had moved beyond it. Susan pointed to the screen. Without your notarized signature, nothing transfers. So the house has never been at risk of legally changing hands. She chose her words carefully. Legally? Correct. I appreciated the distinction, because legally protected and emotionally betrayed were two different things. Susan reached into the folder. There is something else. She handed me another document. At the top were the words limited power of attorney. I read slowly. It authorized Nathan Graham to execute documents relating to the sale of my lake house. Except there was no signature, no notary, nothing, just blank lines. When was this prepared? About 2 weeks ago. Who requested it? Your husband. I kept reading. If signed, would this have allowed him to complete the sale? For specific documents, yes. But only if I voluntarily signed it. Exactly. I placed the paper back on the table. Another important distinction. No forgery, no counterfeit documents. Only an expectation that I would eventually cooperate. Susan studied me for a moment. I hope you don't mind me saying this. Go ahead. I've worked in real estate closings for nearly 25 years. I waited. The people attempting fraud usually avoid title companies. I raised an eyebrow. Why? Because title companies verify ownership. She smiled faintly. What concerned us wasn't forged paperwork. It was how often everyone spoke for you. That sentence stayed with me. Everyone spoke for you. Not once had anyone simply asked me. A knock interrupted us. The receptionist opened the door. They're here. Susan looked at me. Would you like a few minutes? No. I've waited long enough. Nathan walked in first. He froze the instant he saw me. His face lost all color. Lyla. Behind him came Patricia and Richard. Patricia stopped so abruptly that the realtor nearly walked into her. No one spoke. Finally, Susan broke the silence. Good morning, everyone. Nathan attempted a smile. I wasn't expecting Lyla this early. Susan answered before I could. As the property owner, Ms. Graham was always expected. Nathan looked down. Patricia recovered faster. Of course, she laughed softly. We were simply coordinating schedules. Nobody in the room believed that. The tension thickened. Then another man entered, carrying a leather portfolio. He looked around the room with polite curiosity. When his eyes landed on me, recognition appeared immediately. You must be Lyla. I stood. You must be Michael. He smiled. I'm glad we finally met. He offered his hand. I'm sorry our first conversation happened under these circumstances. So am I. There was something refreshingly direct about him. No manipulation, no excuses, just honesty. Susan invited everyone to sit. Michael chose the chair beside me instead of across from Nathan. That tiny decision did not go unnoticed. Susan began reviewing the standard closing checklist. Then she reached the final requirement. Seller signature. Silence. She looked directly at me. As sole owner of record, only Ms. Graham may authorize this transaction. No one moved. Nathan finally cleared his throat. Lyla, maybe we should discuss this privately. I didn't answer. Patricia leaned forward. Honey, we can explain everything. You've had weeks, Richard added quietly. The financial situation became more complicated than anyone expected. So you decided to solve it with my property? He looked away. Michael frowned. This is the first time anyone has mentioned financial problems. Patricia immediately smiled at him. Oh, nothing serious. Michael didn't look convinced. He turned toward me. May I ask you something? I nodded. When we first spoke on the phone, yes. Were you genuinely hearing about the sale for the first time? I looked him directly in the eyes. Yes. The room fell completely silent. Michael slowly opened his portfolio. I thought so. Nathan shifted uneasily. What do you mean? Michael reached inside and removed a thick stack of printed papers secured with a binder clip. I've been in business for over 20 years. He placed the documents on the conference table. When something feels inconsistent, I keep records. Patricia's smile disappeared. Michael looked at me. I printed every email, every text message, every scheduling request, and every document your husband sent me over the past 3 months. He gently slid the stack across the table until it stopped in front of me. I think they belong to you now. I looked down at the binder. 3 months, far longer than I had imagined. For a moment, nobody reached for the stack of papers. It sat in the center of the conference table like a witness waiting to testify. I looked at Michael. Thank you. He nodded once. I wish this had happened under different circumstances. So do I. Susan, the title officer, quietly closed the official closing folder. I think, she said carefully, it's appropriate that we pause today's transaction. No one objected. There wasn't much left to argue. Without my signature, the meeting had nowhere to go. Nathan rubbed his forehead. Lyla, can we please have a few minutes alone? I looked at Susan. Would it be all right if Michael and I reviewed these documents in another room first? Of course. She led us into a smaller conference room across the hall. Once the door closed, the silence felt entirely different. Not hostile, just honest. Michael slid the binder toward me. I organized everything by date. You did. I own several businesses. Whenever large amounts of money are involved, I keep records. I smiled faintly. My aunt used to tell me paperwork remembers better than people. He chuckled. She sounds like someone I would have liked. I opened the binder. The first page was a timeline. Every phone call, every email, every property visit, every price adjustment. Everything was documented. The earliest email dated back almost 3 months. Subject, Lake Property Opportunity. Nathan had written, My wife and I have decided it's time to move forward. The property has sentimental value, but financially it no longer makes sense to keep it. I read the sentence again. My wife and I. He hadn't said he hoped I would agree. He hadn't said we were discussing it. He presented the decision as already made. I turned another page. Patricia had joined the conversation 2 days later. She wrote, Lyla has always trusted Nathan with financial matters. She's attached to the home because of family memories, but once everything is finalized, she'll understand this is the best decision for everyone. I closed my eyes briefly. That sentence explained almost everything. Not because it was cruel, because it revealed exactly how they viewed me. Not as an equal participant, not as the legal owner, as the emotional obstacle standing between them and the money. Michael watched quietly. I'm sorry. For what? I should have asked more questions. You had no reason to suspect anything. I did, eventually. When? He leaned back in his chair. When your husband kept postponing introductions. I looked up. He always had a reason. What kind? Lyla's out inspecting bridges. Lyla's traveling. Lyla's working late. Lyla hates conference calls. He shrugged. At first, those explanations sounded perfectly reasonable. I nodded. They would, but after a while, he paused. I realized I'd been negotiating for nearly 3 months without ever hearing from the actual owner. I continued reading. Another email caught my attention. Subject: pricing strategy. Nathan suggested listing the house at $138 million. Patricia responded within 20 minutes. Lower it. Fast sale matters more than maximum price. I frowned. A week later, another exchange. Reduced to $1,031 million then. Accept serious cash offers immediately. Then, don't wait for spring. Sell before year-end. Every conversation pointed toward one objective. Speed. Not value, not negotiation, just speed. Did that seem unusual to you? I asked. Michael nodded. Very. Why continue? Because I assumed there was a personal reason. He smiled awkwardly. Families sometimes prioritize simplicity over maximizing profit. I've seen that happen before. Fair enough. I probably would have believed the same thing. Another section contained text message screenshots. Nathan Patricia thinks we're close. Michael still hoping to meet Lyla before closing. Nathan. She's overwhelmed with work. I'll handle everything. Michael understood. The next exchange came 2 weeks later. Michael has Lyla reviewed the inspection. Nathan, she trusts me completely. Reading those words hurt more than I expected, because once upon a time, they had been true. I had trusted him. Completely. Not because he demanded it. Because marriage depends on believing the person beside you won't quietly make life-changing decisions behind your back. Michael broke the silence. May I ask you something? Go ahead. Were you and Nathan having financial problems? I thought about it. No, not from my perspective. He never mentioned struggling. He always said business was steady. Michael nodded slowly. That explains something. What? He opened another folder. I received this during due diligence. Inside was a standard financial questionnaire. Nathan had checked a box stating seller seeking accelerated transaction for personal investment opportunity. Investment opportunity, not debt, not financial pressure, not emergency. Another lie. He never told me that either, I said quietly. Michael sighed. I don't think he wanted anyone asking questions. I kept reading. Then I reached the escrow paperwork, the purchase price, deposit received, closing costs, transfer estimates. One number caught my attention immediately. Earnest money deposit, $131,000. I looked up. You already transferred this 3 weeks ago? Into escrow? Yes. My stomach tightened. That wasn't a promise anymore. That was real money. I assume it's protected? It is. The funds stay in escrow until closing or cancellation. I nodded. At least he wasn't personally exposed. Still, someone had been willing to accept over $100,000 while counting on my cooperation, or my guilt, or my exhaustion, whatever came first. Michael studied my expression. I don't blame you for stopping this. I appreciate that. He smiled gently. I wasn't worried about losing the house. You weren't? No. I was worried that someone wasn't telling the truth. That sentence lingered. Because Michael hadn't been searching for a bargain. He'd been searching for certainty. I understood that. I lived my professional life the same way. Facts first. Everything else second. Another document slipped loose from the binder. A printed calendar, property photography, open house, inspection, dock inspection, appraisal, walkthrough, closing. Every event had already been scheduled. Then I noticed something written in Patricia's handwriting beside the closing date. Everything depends on keeping Lyla calm until Monday. I stared at the words. There it was. The plan. Not to convince me, not to persuade me, to delay telling me until the very last possible moment. If they gave me enough time to think, I would refuse. If they waited until everything was complete, maybe I would feel too guilty to stop it. Michael quietly asked, "Is something wrong?" I handed him the page. He read the handwritten note. His eyebrows slowly rose. "I never saw this." "It wasn't meant for you." "No, it wasn't." He looked genuinely disturbed. "I've negotiated difficult deals. I've seen families argue over money. But this," he shook his head, "this wasn't negotiation. No, it was pressure." Before either of us spoke again, my phone vibrated. It was my attorney, Rebecca Lawson. I had emailed her copies of several documents over the weekend, asking only one question. "What should I be looking for?" I answered. "Hi, Rebecca. I've reviewed everything." Her voice was calm. "What do you think?" "There are no forged signatures," I noticed, "which is important." I waited. "But there's something else." "What?" "I ran public record searches on Nathan's brokerage." I sat up straighter. "What did you find?" "A pattern." "What kind of pattern?" "Several commercial properties connected to his company have recorded notices of default within the last 6 months. I looked across at Michael. Rebecca continued. "There are also lender filings involving personally guaranteed business loans." My pulse quickened. So this wasn't simply about wanting to sell a vacation house." She paused. "It appears someone may have needed the proceeds from that sale much more urgently than anyone admitted." I slowly lowered the phone. For the first time, the missing piece wasn't about my house. It was about why they had been so desperate to turn it into cash. I thanked Rebecca and ended the call. For several seconds, neither Michael nor I spoke. He could tell from my expression that the conversation had changed something. "What did your attorney find?" I looked down at the stack of documents before answering. "She doesn't think this was ever about the lake house?" He frowned. "I thought that was obvious." "No. I think the lake house was the solution." He leaned forward. "To what?" I took a slow breath. "Financial problems." His face tightened. "Serious ones. My attorney wouldn't speculate. She only said Nathan's business has multiple commercial loans showing signs of distress." Michael sat back in his chair. "That explains the urgency." "It might." Neither of us wanted to jump to conclusions. There was still a difference between struggling financially and plotting to sell someone else's property. But now I had a direction. Rebecca had already asked me to meet her that afternoon. By 1 o'clock, I was sitting across from her in her office, overlooking the Mississippi River. Rebecca Lawson wasn't dramatic. That was one of the reasons I hired her years earlier to review my estate planning documents after Aunt Eleanor died. She never exaggerated. She simply organized facts. She slid a thick folder across the desk. "I printed everything." Inside were public filings, court records, business registrations, commercial lending notices. None of it was secret. It had simply never crossed my mind to look. Rebecca opened the first page. "Nathan's brokerage expanded aggressively 3 years ago. I knew he was growing. He financed most of that growth." I nodded. "That's common." "It is?" She pointed to another page. "The problem is what happened afterward." Several commercial office developments had stalled. One retail project had lost its anchor tenant. Another mixed-use property remained mostly vacant. Then came higher interest rates, construction delays, insurance increases. Each problem by itself looked manageable. Together they became something much larger. Rebecca tapped a highlighted paragraph. "These are notices of default." I recognized the term but wanted to hear her explanation. What exactly does that mean? It means the lender is formally warning that loan obligations aren't being met. Not necessarily foreclosure. No. But it's a serious step. She flipped another page. Here. This filing showed Nathan had personally guaranteed one of the loans. I looked at the amount. Nearly $2.4 million. My eyes widened. I had no idea. I'm not surprised. Why? Business owners often separate company finances from household discussions. She paused. That isn't unusual. What becomes unusual, she tapped another document, is when someone starts searching for immediate liquidity. Immediate cash, fast closing, cash buyer. Everything suddenly lined up. I remembered Patricia's emails demanding price reductions, not because they wanted the highest value, because they wanted certainty. Rebecca continued. I also searched investment records connected to Patricia. Can you do that? Public civil filings. Nothing private. She handed me another document. Several years earlier, Patricia had invested heavily in a luxury retirement community development. The project collapsed after litigation between developers. Large portions of investor money disappeared into bankruptcy proceedings. Rebecca summarized it simply. She likely lost a substantial amount. I remembered something Patricia had said the previous Christmas. Real estate always comes back. At the time, it had sounded like optimism. Now it sounded like someone trying to convince herself. What about Richard? I asked. Rebecca turned to the final section. He guaranteed 2 separate business obligations. So if Nathan failed, he could become responsible. I leaned back slowly. The room became very quiet. No wonder everyone had been united. Their financial futures had become tangled together. That didn't excuse anything, but it finally explained the motivation. Nobody had been trying to hurt me for entertainment. They believed my lake house represented the fastest escape from a financial collapse. Rebecca watched me carefully. I know what you're thinking. I don't think you do. You feel sorry for them. I smiled weakly. That obvious. You've always been empathetic. I do feel sorry for them. She nodded. You can feel compassion. She folded her hands. You just don't have to finance it. That sentence stayed with me. Compassion and permission were not the same thing. Around 4 that afternoon, Nathan called. This time I answered. Can we meet? His voice sounded exhausted. I think we have to. An hour later, we sat across from each other in a quiet park overlooking one of Minneapolis's lakes. No lawyers, no parents, just the 2 of us. For several minutes, neither of us spoke. Finally, Nathan broke the silence. I'm sorry. I believed he meant it. But apologies arrive differently after trust has been broken. They don't erase the timeline. They don't delete emails. They don't remove lockboxes. What exactly are you sorry for? I asked. He looked surprised. For everything. No. I need specifics. He looked down at his hands. I'm sorry I didn't tell you. Why didn't you? I thought. He stopped. What? I thought once everything was finished. I waited. You'd eventually understand. I stared at him. You planned to explain after the house belonged to someone else. He couldn't meet my eyes. I thought we'd buy another place. With what money? The remaining proceeds. I almost laughed. Remaining, as though replacing Aunt Eleanor's home with another property solved anything. You don't understand. He finally looked at me. I wasn't trying to take something away from you. What were you trying to do? Save everyone. Everyone except me. His shoulders slumped. I know how that sounds. It sounds exactly like what happened. Nathan rubbed his face. I kept telling myself it was temporary. The sale isn't temporary. I know. No. I leaned forward. I don't think you do. That house existed before we met. My aunt left it to me because she trusted me. I promised her I'd protect it. His voice became quieter. I wasn't thinking about that. I know. You were thinking about debt. He nodded slowly. I was drowning. Those 3 words hung between us, not defensive, not manipulative, simply exhausted. I couldn't keep everything afloat anymore. So you decided my house was the answer. I convinced myself it benefited us. I reached into my purse and removed 1 sheet of paper. Patricia's handwritten note. Everything depends on keeping Lyla calm until Monday. I slid it across the bench. Nathan read it. His face fell. I never saw this. But you participated. You let me believe everything was normal. You smiled. You planned vacations. You talked about repainting the guest room. All while strangers toured my property. His eyes filled with regret. I hated every minute. Then why continue? He answered so quietly I almost didn't hear him. Because every day I delayed, the bank called again. Silence settled over us. For the first time, I understood how desperate he had become. But understanding isn't the same as agreement. I finally asked the question that had haunted me since Friday afternoon. Nathan, he looked up. When exactly were you planning to tell me my house was gone? He opened his mouth. Nothing came out. He tried again, still nothing, because there wasn't an answer that could survive the truth. After nearly a minute, he whispered, I don't know. I believed that, not because it excused him, because I realized he had never actually planned beyond the closing. He had focused so completely on escaping one crisis that he never imagined living with what came after. I stood. I've decided something. He looked hopeful. I won't sign. His expression fell. I figured. I'm also not going to spend the rest of my life arguing about whether what happened was legal. It wasn't right. That's enough. He slowly nodded. I understand. I don't think you do. I picked up my purse. But maybe one day you will. As I walked back toward my car, my phone buzzed. It was Rebecca. Only 3 words appeared in the preview before the screen dimmed. They've requested mediation. I stared at Rebecca's message before unlocking my phone. They've requested mediation, not litigation, not another closing. Mediation. I called her before I even started the engine. Who requested it? Your husband's attorney. And the purpose? To see whether the dispute can be resolved without additional legal action. I frowned. What legal action? They're concerned about potential claims. I haven't sued anyone. I know. Rebecca's voice remained steady. But the realtor has withdrawn. The title company documented irregular communication. The buyer has been inconvenienced. Everyone is trying to limit further damage. I leaned back in my seat. When? Friday morning. I'll be there. One more thing. Yes. Bring every document. I already planned to. I thought you would. Friday arrived with clear skies and unusually cool air for early September. The mediation office occupied the top floor of a renovated warehouse overlooking the river. Nothing about the room felt hostile. A long oak conference table, coffee in the corner, large windows, neutral artwork. It was designed to encourage conversation instead of confrontation. Rebecca and I arrived first. She arranged our documents into several organized binders. Chronological order, I asked. She smiled. You know me too well. I've learned from the best. A few minutes later, the others arrived. Nathan, Patricia, Richard, their attorney David Reynolds. Jennifer Brooks, the realtor. Susan Ellis from the title company. To my surprise, Michael Carter walked in as well. He smiled politely. I was asked whether I'd be willing to answer questions. I'm glad you came. So am I. The mediator introduced herself. My role isn't to decide who's right. My job is to help everyone understand where they stand and determine whether there's a path forward. Everyone nodded. The meeting began quietly. David spoke first. My clients acknowledge communication mistakes. I immediately noticed the wording. Communication mistakes, not deception, not concealment, just mistakes. Rebecca calmly replied, My client believes the issue extends beyond communication. The mediator looked toward me. Ms. Graham, would you like to explain why you're here today? I looked around the room. Every face represented a different part of the last 3 months. The husband who chose silence. The in-laws who believed family obligation outweighed ownership. The buyer who unknowingly walked into someone else's crisis. The professionals who had eventually started asking the right questions. I took a slow breath. I'm not here because someone wanted to buy my lake house. Everyone listened. I'm here because everyone discussed selling it except the person who owned it. No one interrupted. I continued. People keep asking whether I feel hurt. That's true. But hurt isn't actually the central issue. The central issue is that decisions were made for me while I was deliberately kept uninformed. The mediator nodded. Can you explain that? Rebecca slid the first document forward. The timeline. The mediator examined it. Every email, every showing, every inspection, every meeting, every price reduction, every conversation, everything was dated, everything fit together. Rebecca spoke quietly. Notice something. The mediator looked closer. What am I looking for? There isn't a single communication directly involving Ms. Graham. The mediator slowly turned page after page. Finally, she looked toward Nathan. Is that accurate? Nathan lowered his eyes. Yes. Patricia shifted uncomfortably. David adjusted his glasses. Nobody challenged the timeline. Rebecca opened the second binder. Next. Jennifer's internal notes. The listing agreement, showing schedules, Patricia's emails, the handwritten note. Everything depends on keeping Lyla calm until Monday. The mediator read it twice. Then she asked Patricia, Did you write this? Patricia hesitated. Yes. What did you mean? Patricia looked genuinely emotional for the first time. I meant... She stopped. I didn't want everything falling apart before closing. The mediator remained calm. So delaying the conversation was intentional. Patricia nodded almost imperceptibly. Yes. The room became very quiet. Rebecca didn't say a word. She didn't need to. The documents were speaking for themselves. Next came Michael. The mediator turned toward him. Mr. Carter, when did you first become concerned? Michael answered without hesitation. When I realized I'd never spoken with the property owner. Were you told why, repeatedly? What explanations were given? He opened his own folder. I kept records. A faint smile crossed Rebecca's face. Of course he had. Michael continued. I was told Ms. Graham was traveling. Inspecting infrastructure. Unavailable. Busy. Preferred that her husband handle details. Were those statements made once? No. He handed copies to the mediator. They were repeated for nearly 3 months. The mediator carefully compared his emails with Rebecca's timeline. Every date matched. Every explanation matched. No contradictions. She finally looked toward Nathan. Did you write these emails? Yes. Were they accurate? Nathan stared at the table. No. Another silence settled across the room. This one felt heavier, because the facts were no longer disputed, only the reasons behind them remained. The mediator asked one final question. "Why?" Nathan answered before anyone else could. "I thought I was buying time." The mediator waited. "My business was collapsing. My parents had financial exposure. I convinced myself that once everything settled down," his voice cracked, "I'd fix it." "How?" "I don't know." That answer sounded painfully familiar, because it was exactly what he had admitted to me in the park. The mediator nodded slowly. "So there was never an actual plan after closing?" Nathan whispered, "No." Richard finally spoke. "We all believed selling the property solved the immediate problem." The mediator turned toward him. "Did you know Miss Graham opposed selling it?" Richard sighed deeply. "We never asked." "Why not?" He looked directly at me for the first time that morning. "Because we honestly believed," he paused, "that once she understood how serious everything was, she'd sacrifice for the family." There it was, the assumption underneath everything. Not fraud, not forged signatures. Expectation, pressure, guilt, family obligation. Rebecca leaned forward. "Mr. Graham," Richard looked at her. "Did you understand Miss Graham was the sole legal owner?" "Yes." "So why proceed?" He answered honestly. "I thought ownership wasn't the biggest issue." "What was keeping the family together?" I spoke before anyone else could. "You weren't trying to keep the family together." Everyone looked at me. "You were trying to keep the finances together." Richard didn't argue, because he couldn't. The mediator looked toward Patricia. "Do you have anything you'd like to add?" Patricia slowly removed her reading glasses. For the first time since I'd known her, she looked tired. Not polished, not composed, just tired. "I spent my whole life believing families solve problems together." She looked at me. "I forgot something." "What?" "They still have to ask." I felt something inside me soften. Not enough to erase what happened, but enough to recognize the difference between an excuse and an admission. She continued, "I kept telling myself you'd forgive us." "I probably would have." She blinked. "What?" "If someone had come to me before any paperwork. If someone had said, 'We're in trouble. Can we talk?' I would have listened." Tears filled Patricia's eyes. "I know." "No." I shook my head gently. "I don't think you did." Rebecca quietly slid one final envelope toward the mediator. "I have one last document." The mediator opened it. Inside was a certified copy of a notice already filed with the county and sent to the brokerage. She looked up. "What is this?" Rebecca answered. "A formal notice instructing that no future transaction involving the lake house may proceed without direct written confirmation from Ms. Lyla Graham." She paused. "It has already been acknowledged by every relevant party." Nathan closed his eyes. Patricia looked down. Richard slowly exhaled. There would be no second attempt, no misunderstanding, no one speaking for me again. The mediator carefully placed the notice back into its envelope. "I believe," she said quietly, "that today's discussion has made everyone's legal position very clear." No one disagreed. The mediation ended without raised voices. No one stormed out. No one slammed a folder shut. In some ways, that made it feel heavier. People often imagine family conflicts ending with dramatic confrontations. Mine ended with signatures acknowledging documents that should never have existed in the first place. Before anyone left the conference room, the mediator summarized what had been agreed upon. The listing would be withdrawn immediately. The purchase agreement would be terminated. The escrow funds would be returned to Michael in full. No future marketing or negotiations involving the lake house could occur without my direct written authorization. The brokerage would update its internal procedures regarding properties involving married owners when only one spouse held legal title. Everyone signed, including Nathan. When it was over, Susan Ellis from the title company walked over to me. "I wanted to tell you something." "What is it?" She smiled gently. I've already contacted the brokerage." I looked surprised. We're organizing additional staff training." "For this?" "In part." She folded her hands. This situation reminded everyone that ownership records matter more than assumptions. I appreciated hearing that. Professionals weren't pretending nothing had happened. They were learning from it. Jennifer Brooks approached next. She looked genuinely embarrassed. "I owe you another apology." "You already apologized." "I know. But after thinking about everything," she shook her head. "I relied too heavily on confidence instead of verification." I smiled politely. "You weren't the only one." She gave a sad laugh. "No, I certainly wasn't." She hesitated. "I've already changed the way I handle listings." "How?" "If the legal owner hasn't personally participated early in the process." She shrugged. "I won't move forward, even if another family member insists, especially then." I nodded. That answer gave me more peace than I expected. If my experience prevented someone else from going through the same thing, at least something good had come from it. Outside, Michael caught up with me in the parking lot. I wanted to make sure we're all right." I smiled. "We were never the problem." "I know." He looked toward the river for a moment. "I'll admit." "What?" "I was disappointed when I realized I wasn't buying the property." I laughed softly. I would have been too. It's beautiful. "It is." He looked back at me. "But I'm much happier knowing it stayed with the person who actually wanted it." That simple sentence meant more than he probably realized. Not the person who could profit from it, the person who loved it. We shook hands before heading to our separate cars. As I drove away, I felt lighter. Not happy, not yet, but lighter. 3 days later, Rebecca called. "The brokerage has officially withdrawn the listing." "Already?" Completely." She emailed me the confirmation while we were still speaking. Listing status withdrawn, marketing materials removed, property websites deactivated, showing access canceled. I read every line twice. Then a second email arrived. Escrow had released Michael's earnest money. Every dollar had been returned. No lawsuits, no disputes, no arguments, just paperwork closing the chapter exactly as it should have. Rebecca laughed quietly. "You know what?" "What?" "This may be the first real estate dispute I've handled where everyone eventually accepted reality." "I wouldn't say everyone accepted it. They accepted they couldn't change it." She had a point. Nathan moved out the following weekend. There was no dramatic fight, no police, no shouting. He packed carefully, almost respectfully. We spent most of Saturday sorting through 15 years of shared life. Books, kitchen equipment, camping gear, old photographs. Every object seemed to ask the same question. How did two people who once trusted each other end up here late that afternoon? He carried the last box toward the front door. "Lyla." "Yes, I know I don't deserve an answer." He hesitated. "But do you hate me?" I thought about it honestly. "No." He looked surprised. "I don't hate you. I hate what you chose." Those words seemed to land harder than anger ever could. "I kept thinking," he said quietly, "that I was protecting everyone." "You were protecting a problem," he frowned. "What do you mean?" "You weren't saving your family. You were delaying consequences." He looked down. I continued. If the business needed restructuring, that should have happened. If loans couldn't be repaid, that reality still existed. Selling my house wouldn't have solved the decisions that created those debts. He slowly nodded. I know. I wish I'd understood that sooner. So do I. He reached into his pocket. I found something. He handed me a small brass key. I recognized it immediately. The old storage cabinet at the lake house. I forgot we moved some things. I looked at the key. What things? A few boxes. My pulse quickened. What boxes? He swallowed. The photographs. Aunt Eleanor's photographs, the albums, several framed pictures, a small wooden memory box. Relief washed over me. I thought they were gone. No. I packed them away during staging. I was going to put everything back. When... He couldn't answer. Again. There it was. The future version of himself that always intended to fix everything. The version that never actually arrived. I'll bring them tomorrow, he said. You don't have to. I want to. The next afternoon, he returned exactly as promised. No speeches, no excuses. He carried 3 storage bins into my garage. Inside were dozens of carefully wrapped family photographs. The old rocking chair cushion, Aunt Eleanor's handwritten recipe binder, boxes of Christmas ornaments, a weathered fishing tackle box, and finally, the framed photograph that had once hung beside the staircase. Aunt Eleanor standing beside me on the dock. I couldn't have been more than 12. Both of us laughing, covered in paint after rebuilding the railing. Nathan noticed me staring at it. I'm sorry. I know. You can stop apologizing. He nodded. I hope someday. I gently interrupted him. Don't finish that sentence. He looked confused. Why? Because hope only matters when it's followed by different choices. He accepted that, quietly. Then he left. A week later, I drove back to the lake house alone. The realtor's lockbox was gone. The for sale sign had disappeared. The driveway looked exactly the way I remembered. The house felt strangely empty without all the staged furniture. So I spent the weekend putting everything back. Not because buyers no longer mattered, because I did. I carried Aunt Eleanor's photographs inside one by one. Each frame returned to its original place. The rocking chair went back beside the window overlooking the water. The old quilt covered the couch again. The recipe binder returned to the kitchen shelf. Every object reclaimed a small piece of the home's identity. Late Sunday afternoon, I stepped outside onto the dock with a cup of coffee. The lake was perfectly still. For the first time in months. The silence felt peaceful instead of uncertain. Just as I was about to go inside, my mailbox door clicked shut. Someone had left an envelope. No stamp, no mailing address, only my name, written in Patricia's unmistakable handwriting. I stood on the dock for another minute, staring at the envelope in my hand. Patricia's handwriting was unmistakable, elegant, carefully practiced. Even after everything that had happened, seeing my name written by her made my chest tighten. For a brief moment, I considered throwing it away unopened, not out of anger, out of exhaustion. Over the past several months, every phone call, every meeting, and every envelope had carried another surprise I hadn't asked for. I wasn't sure I wanted one more. Instead, I carried it inside, placed it on the kitchen table, and made myself a cup of coffee before opening it. I wanted to read whatever she had written with a clear mind. The letter was only 3 pages. The first line caught me off guard. Dear Lyla, I'm writing this because every time I try to apologize in person, I spend more time defending myself than listening to what I've done. That sounded painfully accurate. Patricia had always been articulate. She could explain almost anything. sometimes so well that the explanation distracted from the original problem. I kept reading. She admitted that losing money had frightened her more than she had ever admitted to anyone. Not because of the money itself, because of what it represented: status, a reputation, control. She wrote that after Richard retired, she had quietly invested a large portion of their savings into several real estate partnerships that friends had recommended. When those projects failed, she convinced herself the losses were temporary. Then more investments declined. Instead of telling the family the truth, she kept pretending everything was fine. By the time Nathan's business began struggling, she was already carrying years of private shame. The letter continued. When Nathan told us he might lose everything, I saw one solution standing in front of me. Not because I believed it belonged to me, because I convinced myself that saving the family justified asking forgiveness later. I stopped reading. That sentence deserved time. Not because it excused her, because it finally matched every decision she had made. She hadn't been acting out of greed alone. She had been acting out of fear. Fear disguised as confidence. Fear disguised as practicality. Fear disguised as family loyalty. I finished the letter. Near the end, she wrote something else. You were always the legal owner. I never doubted that. I simply believed you loved us enough to sacrifice what mattered to you. I folded the pages carefully. There it was, the first complete admission. No excuses, no blaming Nathan, no pretending she misunderstood the law. She had known exactly whose house it was. She had simply expected love to overcome boundaries. My phone rang. Rebecca. I've received something you should know about. What happened? Patricia asked whether I'd forward an additional document to you. What document? A signed statement. Later that afternoon, I stopped by Rebecca's office. She handed me a sealed envelope. Inside was a notarized declaration. It wasn't legally required. No court had ordered it. Patricia had prepared it voluntarily. The document acknowledged 3 simple facts. First, the lake house had always belonged solely to Lyla Graham. Second, any efforts to market or negotiate its sale occurred without Lyla's knowledge or authorization. Third, Patricia accepted responsibility for encouraging those actions. I read the final paragraph twice. I understand that forgiveness, if it is ever offered, does not restore the privilege of making decisions for another person. Rebecca watched quietly. What do you think? I searched for the right words. This is the first time she's written something that wasn't trying to persuade me. Rebecca nodded. I had the same impression. She leaned back. You know, many people think closure comes from winning. Does it? No. It usually comes when people stop arguing with reality. I smiled. That's a very lawyer answer. It is. We both laughed. It felt good, not because anything had been forgotten, because life was beginning to include moments that weren't completely defined by conflict. A few days later, Patricia asked whether I would meet her. Not at the family home, not at her house, at a small cafe overlooking the lake. I almost declined. Then I realized something. Listening didn't require agreeing. So I went. She was already seated when I arrived. For the first time in years, she wasn't dressed as though she were attending a charity luncheon. Simple sweater, blue jeans, no expensive jewelry except her wedding ring. She stood as I approached. Thank you for coming. I can stay for about an hour. That's more than I expected. We ordered coffee. For several minutes, we simply watched boats crossing the water. Finally, Patricia spoke. I've rehearsed this conversation 100 times. I imagine you have. And every version sounded wrong. I waited. So I'll just tell the truth. She looked directly at me. I was ashamed of losing money. Yes. But even more ashamed of admitting I'd made terrible decisions. She smiled sadly. I've spent my whole life believing people came to me because I always had answers. What happens when the person with all the answers creates the problem? I didn't respond. She answered her own question. They start hiding. She looked out toward the lake. I kept telling Richard that we only needed one opportunity. Then another. Then another. I stopped seeing risk. I only saw rescue. I quietly stirred my coffee. I understand why you were afraid. She looked hopeful for just a second. Then I continued. But understanding isn't permission. The hope disappeared. I know. No. I shook my head gently. I think you know it now. She nodded. You're right. Another silence settled between us. This one wasn't uncomfortable. It was simply honest. Finally, she reached into her purse and placed a small envelope on the table. What's this? The spare key. I looked at it without touching it. The one we kept after helping with repairs years ago. I shouldn't have had it. No, you shouldn't have. I had copies destroyed. I'll never use this one again. I picked it up. One small brass key. It represented far more than a lock. It represented access, trust, permission. Things that can't simply be assumed. I appreciate you returning it, I said. I don't expect another one. You won't receive one. She nodded without argument. I understand. As we stood to leave, she hesitated. Lyla! Yes, I hope someday you'll remember more than this. I thought about Aunt Eleanor, about the summers on the dock, about the years before debt and fear changed everything. I already do. She looked surprised. I remember birthdays, Christmas dinners, the time you stayed all night with me after my appendix surgery. You weren't always the person from these last few months. Tears filled her eyes. But, I continued gently, those memories don't change what happened. They simply remind me that good memories and firm boundaries can exist at the same time. She nodded once. Thank you. As she walked toward her car, I realized I felt something unexpected. Not reconciliation, not renewed trust. Peace. Because for the first time since Michael's phone call, I no longer felt responsible for fixing anyone else's choices. I was only responsible for protecting my own. When I returned to the lake house that evening, I unlocked the front door with the only key that would ever matter again. Mine. Autumn arrived quietly. The maple trees surrounding the lake shifted from deep green to shades of amber and crimson, and every cool morning carried the smell of pine, damp earth, and wood smoke. It had always been my favorite season at the lake house. For the first time in nearly a year, I was there because I wanted to be, not because I was checking locks, not because I was collecting evidence, not because I was preparing for another meeting with lawyers, just because it was home. The first thing I did was replace every lock on the property, not because I believed Patricia or Richard would return, not because I thought Nathan would try to enter. I changed them because I wanted every key in existence to represent a choice I had personally made. The locksmith handed me a small envelope containing the new keys. Only 4 copies, he said. That's perfect. I placed one in my purse, one in my emergency safe, one inside a secure lockbox. The 4th stayed in my desk drawer. There would be no hidden copies, no forgotten spare keys, no assumptions, only intentional access. It felt surprisingly symbolic. A week later, I invited a few close friends for dinner. Not a celebration, more like a quiet beginning. Most of them had known pieces of the story, but had respected my decision not to discuss it while everything was unfolding. As we sat on the deck watching the sunset, my friend Melissa looked around the property. It feels different. It does. She smiled. It finally feels lived in again. I looked toward the living room through the open sliding doors. Aunt Eleanor's quilt rested on the couch. Her rocking chair faced the lake. The framed photographs were back on the wall exactly where they had belonged all along. The house no longer looked staged for strangers. It reflected the life that had actually been lived there. That mattered. Later that evening, after everyone had left, I walked down to the dock. The water was perfectly still. I thought about everything that had happened since Michael's unexpected phone call. If he had simply assumed Nathan spoke for me, if Susan at the title company hadn't insisted on verifying ownership, if Jennifer hadn't eventually started asking questions, the outcome could have become far more complicated. The legal system hadn't rescued me. People doing their jobs carefully had. That realization stayed with me. Justice isn't always dramatic. Sometimes it's a county clerk verifying a deed. Sometimes it's a title officer refusing to ignore an inconsistency. Sometimes it's a buyer deciding to keep every email instead of deleting them. And sometimes justice is simply saying no before someone else's plan becomes your obligation. A month later, my divorce was finalized. Nathan and I met only once to sign the remaining paperwork. There was no hostility left between us, only acceptance. As we walked toward the parking lot afterward, he stopped beside his car. "Lyla." I turned. "I wanted to tell you something." I waited. "I sold the brokerage." I blinked. "You did?" "There wasn't another realistic option." He gave a small, tired smile. "I finally stopped trying to save a version of my life that no longer existed." I could hear something different in his voice. Not defeat. Responsibility. "What happens now?" I asked. "I accepted a position with another commercial firm. No ownership, no debt, no pretending." He laughed quietly. "It turns out sleeping at night is worth more than I realized." "I'm glad." "I mean that." "So do I." He hesitated. "I also wanted you to know, my parents are selling their own vacation condo." I raised an eyebrow. They decided to solve their own problems this time. There was no bitterness in his voice, only reality. "I hope it helps." "So do I." He nodded. "I don't expect us to be friends." "I know. But thank you for listening when I finally told the truth." I considered that for a moment. "I listened." I smiled gently. "Trust is something different." "I understand." For the first time, I believed he truly did. We wished each other well and walked in opposite directions. Neither of us looked back. Several weeks later, I received an invitation from Michael. He had purchased a smaller lakefront property about a mile from mine. His note made me laugh. Apparently, this lake wasn't finished with either of us. I accepted. Over coffee on his new deck, we joked about the strange way we'd first met. "You know," he said, "most people meet their neighbors at cookouts." We met over canceled closing documents. "I think your version is more memorable." "It definitely is." Our friendship developed naturally after that. Nothing rushed, nothing complicated, just two people who appreciated honesty more than appearances. Sometimes we'd fish early in the morning, sometimes we'd compare renovation projects, sometimes we'd simply sit quietly watching the water. There was never an expectation that our friendship had to become anything else. That simplicity felt refreshing. One chilly Saturday afternoon, I finally completed the last project Aunt Eleanor had planned before she passed away. She had always wanted a wooden bench overlooking the western shoreline where the sunsets painted the lake orange every evening. Years earlier, she'd sketched the design on the back of one of her recipe cards. I still had it. Using that old drawing as my guide, I built the bench exactly where she'd imagined it. When it was finished, I carried one final item from the house: the original property deed. Not because it belonged outside, but because I wanted one quiet moment with the document that had unknowingly protected my future. I read Aunt Eleanor's name, then mine. After a few minutes, I returned the deed to a waterproof folder and locked it inside the fireproof safe I'd recently installed in the study. Alongside it were copies of every important document from the past year: the county ownership record, the title company's correspondence, the mediation agreement, Patricia's written acknowledgement. Not because I wanted to relive the past, because those papers represented something important. Evidence had protected my rights. Boundaries had protected my peace. Neither required anger. As the sun disappeared behind the trees, I sat on Aunt Eleanor's new bench and realized something that would have been impossible for me to understand months earlier. The lake house had never been the true inheritance she left me. The real inheritance was her example. She taught me to repair what was broken, to care for what mattered, to keep promises, and perhaps most importantly, to know the difference between sharing something you love and surrendering it because someone else insists. That lesson would stay with me far longer than any deed ever could. Life has a way of revealing who respects your kindness and who quietly mistakes it for permission. If you've ever been placed in a position where family expected your loyalty but ignored your voice, I hope this story reminds you that healthy boundaries are not acts of revenge. They are acts of self-respect. There is a meaningful difference between forgiveness and restored access. You can wish someone well, accept a sincere apology, and still decide they no longer have the privilege of making decisions that affect your life. Those choices are not contradictory, they are often what healing requires. Justice doesn't always arrive through dramatic courtroom victories. Sometimes it comes through patient observation, careful documentation, honest professionals doing their jobs, and the courage to say no when everyone else expects you to sacrifice your peace. If you've experienced something similar, I'd love to hear your thoughts or your own story in the comments. Knowing we're not alone can make difficult seasons a little easier to carry, and if you enjoy thoughtful stories about family resilience, boundaries, and healing, I'd be grateful if you subscribed for more. This is a fictional story created for entertainment, education, and reflection.